Hey, this is Glenn, and I'd like to take a moment to share with you something that God was revealing to me this morning as I was studying scripture. As I was taking notes from what I was reading, I really felt the Lord speaking to me very, very clearly. And it's something that I wanted to share with everybody else because I feel that there may be many of you that are in the same situation that I am in and things that I've been experiencing. So I just wanted to share this with you. And I think it's really, really profound and something that we need to understand. And I want you to know that God has not left you. It may feel like he's not there. It may feel like he's kind of brought you out into this stranded island situation where everything's going crazy and nothing's going the way that you thought it would. But he has not left you. I've been reading Second Samuel chapter 7, and there's a few things in verse 9 that really stood out to me this morning. And this is what the Lord was telling the prophet Nathan to speak to David as David was really wanting to build the temple for the Lord. He was feeling kind of guilty that he was sitting in a house of cedar and that the Ark of the Covenant and the glory of the Lord was behind curtains. But this is what God told Nathan to tell David. And I was with thee whithersoever thou wentest, and have cut off all thine enemies, and have made thee a great name like unto the name of great men that are in the earth. This is really, really profound. Think about what's being said here. God is telling Nathan to tell him that wherever David walked throughout his life, God was with him. That was during the good times, that was during the bad times, that was during the times of intense tribulation, of intense warfare in his life. God walked with him the whole time up until that point, and even past that point, and even today. Okay, he's in heaven right now, and he's going to rule and reign with Jesus in a new heaven and a new earth. God was with him. Think about that. And I want you to think about this, especially if you believe that God has left you. There's some of you that I know that have been extremely obedient to what the Lord has called you to do. He's told you maybe to move to a new place, take a new job, do something different. You've done it, and all of a sudden now you're engaged in all this warfare, and it's not really going the way that you thought it would. Well, it's not that God has left you. He is still with you. Remember this. A lot of times, because we think temporally and we can only think according to what we see, we think that somebody that's walking in the fullness of their calling and the fullness of the blessing of the Lord, yeah, God is with them at that point in time. That's what we think. But here's the deal. God was with them all the way up to that time when they started walking in the fullness of the calling that they have and the fullness of the blessings that God had in store for them. It's not just something that happened overnight. Here's the thing about overnight. When somebody pops up overnight that has not been through the fire, the forces that got them there are not necessarily God, because we have to take a look at David in particular. David was selected and anointed to be king of Israel long before he even took the throne. So there was this waiting period that had to happen. And there was a lot that happened during that waiting period. And it was not all rainbows, unicorns, and roses. It was a very, very difficult road. Remember this as well, that even though David was appointed king, there was somebody else in that position, Saul, who was not a really good king. It was really toxic leadership. So he had to live under that. And just look at David's humility that he had in that situation. He lived under and he served King Saul, a horrible leader, just really terrible. And he had to wait for that time that he ascended to the throne. And, we even know that there were times where David was like, oh, yeah, I could kill him right now and I can move into that spot that God's promised me. But he didn't. He was patient. He waited for God's perfect timing, and God never left him. Here's the other thing, too. A lot of you may be waiting to move into that area of ministry that God's called you to. And you're like, wow, this is really taking a long time. Well, yeah, it does take a long time to move into the fullness of the power of God, to move into the fullness of what He's called you to, and to move into the fullness of blessing. He's not just going to pour out His blessing and all of this responsibility on somebody who's not mature and seasoned to handle it. It'd be like handing a very strong weapon to a child, saying, "Here, go play with this." It takes time and it takes seasoning, and that's what God is doing to encourage some of you even more. Some of you have been waiting years and decades. Well, the greater the call, the longer the time of maturing and seasoning that takes place. So be encouraged with that. God has not left you. If you've been obedient and you're doing everything that God's requiring of you, and you're like, man, this is getting nowhere and this doesn't look anything like I thought it would. Yeah, you're still doing the right thing. God hasn't left you. He is still walking with you. And that's what I love about the Hebrew for "I was with thee whithersoever thou wentest." It means I walked with you. God was walking with David the whole time. Here's the other thing too, is that if you have a calling on your life and you are moving in that calling, guess what you're going to have? You're going to have enemies. And here, God through Nathan is reminding David that all of his enemies, God cut them out from his sight. It says, "And have cut off all thine enemies out of thy sight." Well, this means two things. God took them out of the way. He did it. And it's something of the past. David doesn't even need to think about it or consider it even more anymore. But God took them out of David's sight, and he did it visibly to encourage David that he was with him and that there was nothing that was going to stand in the way of the calling that he had on his life. Nothing is going to stop the calling that God has on your life except for you. And how would that happen? Is if you give up. If you give up hope, if you throw away patience. Don't give up. That's why Paul says, keep running the race. And unfortunately, there are too many Christians, because of the world that we live in, where everything is, hey, I want it now and I want it my way. They quit too soon. Don't quit the race. Go back and think of those times that God has cut off your enemies from your sight. So be encouraged. God has not left you. He's been walking with you. He will continue to walk with you. He has cut off your enemies from your sight, and he will continue to cut off your enemies from your sight. And here's the really neat thing, is when we go back up to the first verse of 2 Samuel chapter 7, it says in verse 1, "And it came to pass when the king sat in his house, and the Lord had given him rest round about from all his enemies." David had brought the glory of the Lord back to Israel. And at this time, he sat in his house, and God rest from his enemies. Keep fighting. There will be a time when all of your enemies, the war will cease, and there will be a time of peace. I don't know when that time is exactly for each one of you, but seek the Lord. Take a look at your circumstances rather than through the lens that we're used to looking through, and look at it from God's eyes. Ask God, where am I in this situation? Where are we in this, Lord? He'll answer the question for you. Where are we? How do I process this? And how do we move forward together? Walk with him. Don't give up. Hey, I just wanted to encourage you today with this word. It just really resounded very clearly to me as I was reading the scripture. And I thought about, maybe I won't cut a lithosbite on this, but I felt really compelled to. So I am doing this in obedience to the Lord to share this with those of you that may need to hear this. Don't give up. God is walking with you.
lithoscry.com